I'm starting off by making the legs, and I'm making these from 8/4 cherry. I usually try to start off with something simple on a project just to knock pieces out of the way. I'm cutting all the legs to be 32 inches because the legs plus the casters plus the chopping block should be about 36 inches, which is countertop height. Now the legs I'm just ripping about square. All of these are going to be cleaned up on the planer, so I'm just getting them as close as possible initially. Now I didn't have enough 8/4, so I just simply used a couple pieces of 4/4 to stick together. There's a few different mortises I have to measure for. The first are for shelves, 1 and 13 inches from the bottom. I also need to measure for some side rail mortises, which are going to connect the legs in 2 sets. I have the measurements on screen because there's quite a few. Now I'm going to be using a mortising machine, and of course there's a lot of different ways you can cut mortises or join pieces without mortise and tenon. Pocket screws would maybe work if you have one of those jigs, but you can also use a drill and chisel to actually hog out mortises. I'm also going to add a chamfer to all of the edges, and if you've watched my videos before, you probably notice I prefer chamfers over roundovers. I just think they look better. Here you get a better picture of the 4 rail mortises on each leg. They have to face each other, so the shelf mortises in each set are facing the same way because 2 sets of legs are going to be connected by the shelf rails. For the side rails, I'm cutting these at 14 inches from 4/4 cherry. I'm then ripping these down to 1 1/4 inch pieces. I'm cutting all my shelf rail pieces, also from 4/4 cherry at 22 inches, and then I'm ripping these down to 2 1/4 inches. All of the tenons are going to be 1 inch by 1/2 inch, and they're going to be 1/2 inch long. This will fit nicely in the mortises, which are 1/2 inch by 1 inch. And once again, of course, I'm adding chamfers to all of the edges. I try to do this as I go, leaving the router table set up if I can. I also try to pre-sand everything, just to limit how much sanding I have to do later when everything's glued together. Speaking of that, I'm now going to glue the side sets first. What I'm doing is just using the rail pieces, the side rails, and gluing 2 sets of legs together initially. This should give you a better picture too at how everything assembles. It's a little hard to explain as we're going along, but once you get the visual, it makes a lot more sense. There's 2 different sets here, and basically I'm using those shelf rails just to connect these from those 4 mortises that I mentioned. So the side rails, the purpose of those is to help hold items on the shelves, but it also adds a whole lot of strength to the whole unit. Next, I'm going to drill holes for the casters before I move on. And for these, I just needed to drill 3/8 inch holes. And of course, this depends on the caster type or adjustable feet that you may want to add. I chose casters, so this would be mobile, of course. Now I have to add slats for shelves, which I'm using maple to contrast with the cherry. I'm cutting all of these to 16 inches in length, which will be the full depth from leg to leg on the cart. Now all of these I'm ripping to 2 1/4 inches simply because that's what I used for the rail and I thought it looked good. I decided to attach these with screws. If I had to do it again, I would maybe add some slots so these could just sit there, not permanently attach. But I thought screws are easy enough and that way they can be replaced or pulled out to be cleaned. But like I said, if they just sat in a slot and could pop out, well, that would make it even easier to clean. So just a good idea, something to keep in mind when you build one. To make this look more like a butcher block, I'm adding some height by adding a skirt around the top, but this does actually serve some functionality for knife holding, which you'll see later. I'm making this out of a maple 1x8, and I'm starting off by cutting 2 pieces at 25 and 5/8 inches. Something to note is it's always good to double check these measurements as you go along, because these have to wrap around the legs. The other 2 pieces I need are 16 and 7/8 inches long. Part of the reason for weird measurements is because I'm using 3/8 inch deep dados on the ends of the long pieces to connect these. Basically, when I put these together, I'm just gluing the shorter pieces in between the longer pieces, sticking right in those dados. And this way, when I go to add chamfers later, I'm not going to worry about a miter not being held together tight enough and having a weird gap showing. This makes it look a lot nicer in the end, and it does make it really easy to connect them. So it's just something to think about when you're connecting pieces in a square or rectangle like this. Maybe skip the miter and try something else. To attach the frame to the skirt, I'm using some spacer blocks made from a 2x2, which will be 1.5 inches thick, and these are leaving room for the butcher block, which will eventually inset in the skirt and sit on top of the frame. Now, you could probably get away with just gluing this in because this is not structural, it's not holding weight. I glued these in place, but I decided it doesn't hurt to add some screws, especially because these ones are not visible. So it's really not a big deal to add these through, just as an extra precaution to make sure the skirt does not split away from the legs. Now I can finally start on the butcher block insert, which is going to be 15.5 by 24, but I'm cutting a bunch of pieces of maple to 26 inches to start because this is going to be end grain, so I actually need this extra length. You'll see how it works out later. I'm ripping all of this to 1-inch strips, which honestly could probably be any measurement you want. This was slightly arbitrary. I'm gluing all the strips up first, using some cauls made out of oak just to help glue all this together, because this will help keep it straight, which definitely reduces the amount of work, especially sanding, you have to do in between this first glue up and then switching everything to end grain. I like to scrape glue after about an hour of glue up before it's cured because it makes it a lot easier to get away excess glue, so it really helps cut down the amount of time spent sanding. But once this was ready, I could cross-cut all the pieces into 1.5-inch strips, which is matching the height I needed for the butcher block. I came up with the design quick. Instead of having them all line up, I thought it would be nice to use that single cherry strip to kind of go back and forth, but you can do whatever you want. Of course, gluing up this time was a little easier because they're all the same size, so I just poured it on and then used this roller from Rockler, and this really helped speed up the process so I wasn't fighting against the setup time of the glue. To square up the board, I'm just using the miter sled that I made in a previous video, and if you haven't seen that, I'll have a link in the description. I also added chamfers, of course, to all the edges of the butcher block, which I probably didn't need to say or even show, but I wanted to make sure people didn't think I did nothing to the edges of the board. Next, to add juice grooves, I'm making this quick jig to add those juice grooves. And it's real simple, it's just a piece of plywood, and I'm using 2x4s initially here because they match the same height as the butcher block at 1.5 inches. I'm screwing these down in a square, figuring out the right distance I needed, and using 2x2s to add a guide that the router can glide across. And of course, to use it, it's pretty simple. You clamp a corner of the butcher block into the jig and then just slide along the router, routing out the groove, and flip it around all the corners until you're done. Next I need a knife slot, which I was originally thinking about building into the block, but I decided instead of cutting that down, I would just use a maple strip. And this way there could just be some slots that hold the knife in between the block and that strip. All I did is use the spiral bit to route some slots, 2 of them along this strip, and they're going to be facing the block here. So that way you can take the block out and this strip and easily clean it. To protect the butcher block and also the strip, I'm using butcher block conditioner, which is basically just oil and wax. Food safe, of course. To finish the stand, I'm using oil-based polyurethane, but now that I think about it, I probably could have just used the butcher block conditioner everywhere. But this worked just fine anyway. Next I can attach the slats, which of course I'm attaching with screws like I mentioned earlier, but I'm also making sure to pre-drill everything, and I'm also using a 5/16 inch spacer here to make sure these are evenly spaced across the whole shelf. But of course it's always to double check yourself, just doing some math to make sure they will space out evenly in case there's any variation. But then of course the last step here is to add the wheels, and then I was finally done with this cart.